Welcome back to another episode of Saturday Huddle. We are here today to preview the upcoming season for the Big 12. I am joined by Mitch Harper, who covers BYU football for KSL Sport. How are you doing today, Mitch?
Doing great, Emily. Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to this. Had the chance to cover the Big 12 now the last handful of years, and it's a fascinating league that should be really intriguing this year. So excited to dive into that and BYU with you. So I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today. And I'm sure it has been quite a fascinating last few years for you, kind of seeing an identity shift in conference with BYU moving to the Big 12. How has that been? I mean, I know I'm kind of throwing you a curveball here, like something that I didn't mention beforehand, but how has it been going from how it was to cover BYU to now with BYU being in a different conference and these different teams with all of these different histories and kind of those different matchups? How has that been? Has that made your job more entertaining, more interesting, or has it stayed relatively the same?
A lot more entertaining for sure. And covering independence, it is the road less traveled. BYU was not an independent like Notre Dame where they're getting access to the biggest bowl games. It was life where you're playing a bunch of middle of the road FCS group of 5 teams in November and you have nothing on the line. Whereas this, you've got access potentially to the playoff, big bowl games, big conference championships, covering things like spring meetings are always fun, getting to know the beat writers around the league. You really kind of look back on that time at BYU as an independent and you kind of realize that BYU was really forgotten. I think you get a little bit of a echo chamber and think, oh, BYU's still nationally relevant but when you pull yourself away and start covering a league that's a Power 4 league, you realize that these entities in college football sometimes get forgotten that are outside of a conference picture. And so being in a conference has been huge for BYU. And the Big 12 was probably always going to be the best fit. BYU always was targeting that league as the one that would be the one that would fit for them, being a faith-based institution. And it's worked out well. And BYU has been highly committed from a financial standpoint and doing everything they can to go win titles and win at a high level. And this upcoming season might create the best opportunity to actually break through and go win a league championship.
Yeah, absolutely. I imagine it has been interesting. And before we get into the conference stuff with everybody in the Big 12, let's spend a few minutes on BYU. So, what should fans expect from the Cougars this season?
Best team in the Kalani Sitake era to this point. And BYU is going into year 11 with Kalani Sitake as the head coach. And, he's a former player who played under the great Lavelle Edwards. And he loves BYU. I mean, it's the place he wants to be at and turn them into a national program once again. And, I think that this is far and away his best team from a talent perspective, depth. They've done a lot of good things in terms of roster construction to put themselves in a position to try to break through and get to the college football playoff for the first time ever. I think BYU is going to be in that conversation. So this is going to be a team worth monitoring nationally throughout the year, also because they've won 23 games the last 2 years, so that alone setting the bar high going into a season. But there's certain mile markers in the schedule that will be maybe some showcase event type stages that will have probably the nation tuning in if BYU lives up to the hype that many people think they're going to live up to this season.
Yeah, absolutely. And it always makes a difference when your coach genuinely wants to be there. I think we've seen that the last few years of his name consistently being in the mix for other college football openings or even going to the NFL. And year after year, we see him remain committed to the Cougars. So that has to feel good for the fan base and the program overall that their coach genuinely wants to be there and has had a good amount of success in the years that he has been the head coach. So what do you consider BYU's biggest strength and their biggest question mark?
Biggest strength probably on the defensive side at linebacker. I think the defense as a whole is probably a strength. Even their first-year defensive coordinator, Kelly Papinga, who replaces Jay Hill, who left for Michigan and followed his mentor, Kyle Whittingham, to the Maize and Blue. Kelly Papinga is a former BYU player, but he even said in spring that he doesn't feel there's any weaknesses. There's strengths across the board on the defense. But if you pinpoint one specific position, it's the linebackers. Two guys in particular, Kedu Luave, transfer, number one linebacker transfer by some outlets in the portal this past cycle. He's going to be, I think, fantastic. One of the fastest players on this BYU team. He's going to be really good. And then Isaiah Glasker, who a couple of years ago led the Big 12 in tackles for loss. Last season, maybe a little bit of a step back just because he was dealing with injuries, but he's a first-team All-Big 12 caliber type of player in that linebacker unit. I think that's the strength of this team. And as far as a weakness goes, Emily, I think that it's the wide receiver position. They lose Chase Roberts and Parker Kingston, two of the top 7 receivers in the Big 12 last season. Roberts is now with the Las Vegas Raiders. And then Parker Kingston had a case where he was alleged of a sexual assault, and he was dismissed from the program. That case has now, been dismissed, but he's still not with the team at this juncture. So BYU's got some big questions at wide receiver. Guys like JoJo Phillips, an Oregon transfer, and Kyler Casper, 6'6" target. He could be in the conversation. Or they're going to have to rely on some freshmen to take over in that spot at wide receiver. So that is probably the glaring question for this BYU team that pretty much across the board feels like they're pretty strong at, with a lot of retention in building out this roster.
Yeah, absolutely. So many strengths, which is good. Fans always love to hear that. And who do you consider to be a BYU player that is poised for a breakout season?
I think it's got to be Bear Bachmeier, the quarterback. And he was really good last season. You could say last year was maybe a breakout, but I think there's another gear or two to Bear Bachmeier. 3,000 passing yards a season ago. He was fantastic. But he dealt with some injuries, the ankle. And I think what was amazing about Bear's rise as a true freshman was that he arrived last year in June, and he took over the quarterback spot and emerged as BYU's first ever week 1 true freshman starter at quarterback. But I think he's got the ability to be one of the best quarterbacks in the Big 12 potentially this year. And I think that from a national perspective, his name alone and then the number 47, that instantly is kind of interesting. And he's a guy that hurdles, and he loves to run the football as well. He's a dual threat guy. I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. He's just kind of a fun personality to watch. Even a couple weeks ago, I was at his concert that he performed with his brother, who's named Tiger, transferred from Stanford as well. And, they like playing guitar. They're unique personalities. I think Bear's going to be someone that continues to take off with that stardom. And I think he has an even bigger year to where he breaks out maybe even more on the national stage this season.
I gotta say, Bear and Tiger are pretty phenomenal names. That's incredible. I think I realized his brother's name was Tiger. That's incredible. So who do you think is the biggest game on BYU's schedule?
I'd say BYU Notre Dame on October 17th. And BYU has wanted the Irish in Provo for so many years. When going back to the conversation of BYU being an independent, when they were an independent, they had a 6-game series with the Irish, but Notre Dame never made an appearance to Provo, and it shrunk to a 3-game series with 2 of them in South Bend and 1 in Vegas. So getting the Irish to Provo, and Notre Dame, to their credit, they lose the USC series. They say, we're still going to schedule someone good. They go on the road at BYU, so credit to them for doing that. And I think that this is going to be a huge game. I think that if BYU lives up to the hype that many think they can and maybe be undefeated going into that October 17th date, and Notre Dame, if they're undefeated, could be talking about the first ever top 10 game in the history of LaVell Edwards Stadium in Provo. BYU's never played in one of those games in Provo. So it could be maybe one of the biggest games ever for BYU football. So it's got to be that one. And I think from a national narrative perspective, you're talking about a BYU program that's been knocking on the door of the playoff the last 2 years,
right?
But they haven't had that signature win that really, gives them a margin for error or catapults them into the playoff conversation or the bracket. And I think that's the game that really can maybe rewrite some narratives about BYU football, because right now it seems like they're kind of viewed as a team that gets a little bit lucky, rides on the margins too much. They get down big and then they storm back. Can they actually, pull off a big win against a team like Notre Dame, who's viewed as a national title contender, was in the national championship game 2 years ago? That'll be a massive opportunity for BYU. And, talking with BYU's AD, Brian Santiago, he even said that they want to do something more long-term with Notre Dame. So this could be the beginning of something maybe really good between BYU and Notre Dame, not only in football, but other sports as well. So that's going to be a massive game for BYU, and not only this year, but in the history of the program.
Absolutely. That is going to be a really great game. And that series in general, like what you were saying, is going to be really important, I think, to the program. So going back to the overall Big 12, who do you think enters the season as the team to beat in the conference?
It's definitely Texas Tech, the reigning Big 12 champs. And, the Brendan Sorsby gambling scandal was just chaotic. And it was probably the first time I think the internet felt unified on something, which was kind of crazy on that. And, but I still think Texas Tech's going to be awesome this year. I think they're going to be really good. Will Hammond, their quarterback, he was cleared by the surgeon 3 weeks ago. I think that they are just loaded once again. And I think people are just assuming their defense is going to be, a shell of what it was last year. I don't think that's the case. I think it continues for Texas Tech. And so I look at Tech as the hands-down favorite right now, and you pair it up with what could be a favorable schedule. I think we all just assume that based on logos on the helmets, but as we know in the Big 12, there could be a team or two that emerges, and it becomes, a game that we don't see right now in July. That's a massive game, but it could be a big one later this year. So I think this is going to be, though, a really good Texas Tech team. I think their development of their roster, it's one thing to buy players and accumulate an expensive roster, but you got to develop them too. I think Texas Tech's done a really good job of that. And even though the whole Sorsby stuff was probably a black eye for PR from a maybe university and the national narrative in the media, I think probably people in that building, they love Joey McGuire still. He's an ultimate culture guy, heck of a ball coach. And I think they've got a great kind of program culture there that maybe it's us against the world type vibe. So even though they're the favorite, they can still play maybe that chip on the shoulder bit as well. So I think that Texas Tech team's still the favorite, and they're the reigning Big 12 champs.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm with you. I think the entire Sorsby thing did unify the internet, and I think they kind of have a target on their back now, because not just for the Big 12, I think that is the team to beat for many people in their heads, because they want to see Texas Tech lose. But I agree with you. I don't know that they're going to necessarily have the fall off that people are expecting them to. It definitely reminds me of Colorado, which is also in your conference, but Colorado a few years ago with Deion Sanders, definitely his first year, but also his second year. They had that target on their back where not just people in their conference wanted them to lose, but there was so much hype around them that wasn't necessarily all of Deion's fault or all of the program's fault in a way, but kind of just media and these conversations that get recycled over and over again. But I feel like Texas Tech has kind of taken that position. And I kind of think it's a little more validated this year, because people really just didn't respond to how that was handled very well at all from an ethical standpoint.
I agree. And I think that it's good to have a villain. I think you've talked about it on this show in the past. I think college football villains are good to have. And I think for the Big 12, they're probably a league that has historically always known of having a villain in Texas back in the day. And so I think it's good for the Big 12 to kind of have that program that maybe takes on the role that everyone wants to take down and chase. And look, I think the investment that they've put into their program, I think, is good for the Big 12, because we all knew that when Texas and Oklahoma left for the SEC, who was going to emerge as the bell cows in this conference. And I think Texas Tech is clearly laying claim to that. And I think this is a year that for Tech and for BYU, that they maybe have a chance to lay claim that they're the big dogs in this conference on an annual basis going forward, because they are investing at a high level. And I think it's good to have that type of program that's investing at a high clip, and you got to go chase that every single year. And So I think it's a good thing. But yeah, that Sorsby stuff was just a mess and a crazy scandal, but also unnecessary too, because I just feel like, with Will Hammond, their quarterback, I think he's going to be excellent for the Red Raiders. And I think he was really good last year. Had he not suffered the ACL last year against Oklahoma State, it makes me wonder if we're even having this conversation about Sorsby and Texas Tech. And maybe Will Hammond would have just been QB1 to begin with, and he would have probably played in that playoff game against Oregon and not Baron Morton, who was really struggling with his injuries late in the season last year.
Yeah, absolutely. So, which coach in this conference do you think enters the season with the most pressure?
Dave Aranda, it's a scorching hot seat for him, and I don't know what the path is for him to keep his job. You almost wonder if it's you got to win 10 games to keep it, because just the negativity around that fan base with him. I mean, he basically kept his job this year because the AD, Mac Rhodes, had to exit unceremoniously, and they bring in a new AD, and the school president didn't feel completely comfortable leading the search for a new football coach. So they kind of just paused for a year and let the new AD settle in. That basically gave Dave Aranda an extra year. So otherwise, he would have been gone had Mac Rhodes, the AD, still been around at Baylor. So I think it's definitely Dave Aranda. That seat is scorching hot. I'm curious to see what he can do with DJ Lagway coming in from Florida, who dealt with a bunch of injuries last season. It seems like now he's healthy, ready to go. Do we see the DJ Lagway from 2 years ago, who was a really rising star in college football 2 years ago with the Gators? Does he return to that form as he goes to a Baylor program that's got strong connections, obviously to his family with his dad once being a Baylor Bear? I think that program, though, it just seems like there's a lot of negativity that's hard to overcome, and I just don't really know what the win total would be for Aranda to actually save his job this year.
Yeah, with you. He is definitely in one of the hottest seats in college football, like nationwide, in my opinion. And what do you think, like who do you think, I should say, is the Big 12 team that is flying under the radar?
I think it's Arizona State. I think Arizona State, with Kenny Dillingham returning to the Valley, turning down, Michigan to stay at Arizona State, I think they're going to become a consistent winner in this conference. You're already seeing that. 2 years ago, they win the league. Last year, a little bit of a dip, but tons of injuries. 8 wins still, and one of those wins was against Texas Tech. I think ASU is always going to be in the mix. I think we're kind of overlooking them a little bit just because, new quarterback, but it wasn't too long ago that Dillingham inherited an unknown Sam Leavitt from Michigan State and turned him into a playoff quarterback and one of the faces of the sport. Could he do the same with Cutter Boley, who comes in from Kentucky? I wouldn't be surprised. They still got, Fett, the freshman, and they got some other quarterback options there, but I like the transfer portal additions that Arizona State brought in, especially at wide receiver, the talent in the secondary too. I think ASU is getting slept on, and I really believe in Dillingham that when they're expected to underachieve, he's gonna outperform those low expectations on an annual basis. So I think ASU is the team to watch, and they go at Texas Tech in the middle of October. I think that's going to be a really good game to see how they perform. But they've already matched up with Tech, and they've won against those guys and had success, and they've won this league. They know how to do it. So I look at ASU as being a team that's getting slept on quite a bit going into this season.
Yeah, absolutely. It will be interesting to see what Dillingham can do with their new quarterback. But like you said, there's a good track record there of him inheriting a quarterback that people really didn't know or were paying attention to. So it'll be interesting. And so, again, looking at the conference, do you consider the Big 12's depth to be its greatest strength, or what do you consider to be the strength of the conference?
I think the strength is that you're seeing an emerging top end of the league that's becoming annual contenders. I talked with Commissioner Brett Yormark in May in a conversation I had with him at the spring meetings, and he even noted that that's a promising sign for the league because the depth of the conference has been kind of the calling card the past few years, but you really need those annual contenders that push comes to shove, it just everyone looks at them and says they're going to be in the mix regardless of their rosters and their personnel. And I think, Tech, BYU, Utah, Arizona State, these are the type of programs that every single year should be viewed as top 25 caliber type teams with the retention of their coaching staffs and their rosters. I think they've got the makings of that. So the depth has been a nice kind of conversation with the Big 12 the past few years, and it is a deep league. And, you on any given year, the bottom could emerge and be in the upper crust of this conference, but they've got to start to have annual contenders every year for this league. Because I think an underlying storyline in this conference is how they've already got, from the league office standpoint, they've already got their eyes set on their next media rights deal for 2030 and trying to find ways to maximize their value in 2030, whatever TV partner it is. And how can they do that? I think you got to have some brands that really emerge, that capture audiences consistently on an annual basis. That's why I think this is an important year for the league. They need to have a playoff run from someone. You would assume that this is probably still a one-bid league on an annual basis until something changes with this league maybe outperforming maybe expectations in the playoffs. So it's an important year for the conference. But I think, the depth is nice, but they've got to have some annual contenders that are national players on a consistent basis emerge. And I think they've got the makings of that with Texas Tech and BYU, and like I said, Utah and Arizona State as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And which preseason expectations seem too high?
I think Utah's a little bit too high right now, and the people would probably look at that and say this BYU guy's saying that. But I think just Utah is a situation where it's kind of like a year one. It's not a carryover from the Kyle Whittingham regime. Like, yes, Morgan Scalley is a Utah man through and through, and I think he's going to do a really good job at Utah. And I think their recruiting is going to go to, some great heights with him. I think he's going to build some great rosters. But just the messy exit of Whittingham kind of having an unofficial deadline of he's not going to be coaching by 2027, he said a few years ago, and then he still wants to keep coaching. But they've kind of had this coach in waiting situation with Scalley. It was a messy deal, and the whole exit, and to have Witt go to Michigan and take a bunch of the coaches and some of the top end guys, there's just some questions there. And I think that the offensive line position is a big question mark for Utah. I think the good thing is, though, for the Utes is that they've got a dynamic quarterback in Devin Dampier and an excellent running back in Wayshawn Parker. And I think also a schedule that sets up really well. You've got BYU at home, but a pretty manageable slate. You avoid Texas Tech on the schedule. It's not unreasonable for Utah to be 9-3, but I think just assume like the machine continues to go. I just think that it's just a new era. It's Scalley's program already. A lot of roster changes as well. So I think that in the new coaches at OC and DC as well, Colton Swan retained as the defensive coordinator. But still, I just think that to say that they're maybe top 20, it might be a little bit much, especially too defensively. We saw against Kansas State and Kansas some real issues stopping the run, and they got to tighten that up a little bit as well. But they'll be in the mix. I just think that I don't know if they're an odds-on lock to be one of the favorites going into the season this year.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I imagine there are some question marks, regardless if it was like a coach in waiting situation. Kind of actually seeing it all come together can look differently than the expectation. So they'll be fascinating to keep our eye on. That was, from a Michigan standpoint, I would view that as like a slam dunk hire in the offseason to manage to land Kyle Whittingham and the people that he brought over. So I'm really excited, when I think objectively, really excited to see, how Michigan plays and like what kind of success they have this season. I've always been a big fan of Kyle Whittingham. I feel like I can say that even though you're BYU and a rival, but I feel like a lot of people just love Kyle Whittingham. So I'm really interested to see how he does and kind of like how Utah looks as a result of it. So
it's a great point. And I think that, I think it speaks to, I think, the quality of, some of these programs that maybe their logos, Utah, BYU, they're not the, blue chip brands or the great brands in college football yet. These premier brands, Michigan, Penn State, in the case of Kalani Sitake, they wanted these operations to move to these programs. I think Whittingham's going to have success. He brings Jay Hill, Jason back. That's going to be a really competitive outlet. And he was a guy that was annually taking down Lincoln Riley in USC. So I just think that that's one of the things with college football is that it's always just interesting when you see, some of these programs that we just look at and say, like, this logo isn't they don't have much history, but yet when a coaching carousel happens, the whole operation moves and goes to this premier brand, and then they become this viewed as a favorite. Like you look at Penn State with Matt Campbell and Iowa State. No one was looking at them as anything special. They were preseason top 25 last year, but no one took them serious as a national title contender. He takes the whole Ames operation to Happy Valley, and now they're looked at as maybe a sleeper to get in the mix for the Big Ten, potentially be a national player for the playoff chase. Like that's where I think some Big 12 fans take, issue with sometimes just it's now a power two. Like, yes, the finances, they can't compete with that right now at all. Like it's a big gap, but I think there's still really good football being played in this conference. And I think this past coaching carousel showed these are some desirable coaches. And for many of these programs to retain their guys, Utah and Iowa State withstanding, and Utah knew the path going forward with Scally, but still really good programs with some good coaches in this league and good football being played.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always entertaining. Like those conversations always take place about strength of schedule or strength of conference, and then the finances get involved. But there are always entertaining games being played in the Big 12, partly due to kind of just the chaos. And I think that's like one of the great things about this conference. Like, BYU being consistently good, we have Texas Tech in the mix, and then we have teams like ASU that can surprise you and actually, hang around in a really entertaining game. So yeah, it's an entertaining conference for sure. And with that, like, what's the biggest unknown entering the season for the Big 12?
I think the biggest unknown for the league is probably, maybe just how they can compete in the playoff. I think that, that was a real eyesore for the league, a black eye, if you will, that Texas Tech just gets blanked. And look, like 7 of the 8 teams the past 2 years in the 12-team playoff haven't won with being a team that's a bye in that first round. They haven't won that quarterfinal game. So outside of Indiana, they're the only one that's been able to have that long layoff and win. But to get shut out, and really their offense was just they weren't even competitive with Oregon. The defense was doing everything they could to hang around with Oregon. But I mean, that was just a bad look. And so they'll get a team in the playoff. We know that with the new rule that Big 12 champ automatically in. But will they get in there and make some noise? I just think that's the big unknown. And whoever gets in from the Big 12, they got to win. They got to make it happen. I mean, Arizona State, it was nice, the double overtime. Texas, the targeting was standing. They didn't win. And, there was a close call. It was a much better showing than Texas Tech. But they got to advance. So, I think that it's still not too far removed from TCU making a run a couple years back, but it's growing farther and farther away. And so whoever gets into this playoff, they've got to compete. And I think that's just the big unknown is how will they match up against an assumed SEC Big Ten opponent.
Yeah, totally makes sense too. Okay, so we're going to move into the lightning round. Kind of the first team person that pops into your head. You may have alluded or talked about some of these answers. Like I can kind of like see you having already talked about it, but still, for the sake of lightning round, we will go through it. So to kick things off, who do you have as the Big 12 champion?
Texas Tech.
Awesome. What's your BYU record prediction?
11-1 in the regular season, only lost to Notre Dame.
Awesome. Dark horse team.
I'll go Arizona State, but I'll give a bonus one. I will also say maybe UCF. I think UCF with Alonzo Barnett. I mean, he's the one quarterback in this league that's actually reached the playoff, led a team there with James Madison a season ago. And UCF, I know he was a punchline at USC. Alex Grinch, the DC, it's pretty good secondary last year. I think they're going to have a good defensive line. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe, UCF can get into the top 7 of the league and maybe be pesky and create some upsets potentially. We know they're always awesome with that Space U game, with the space game. So I think UCF could be one to maybe watch as well potentially.
Love it. Breakout player, either with BYU or in the conference, either or.
I think Jaden Craig, TCU. I think he's going to be excellent. Harvard transfer. He goes to Fort Worth, and Josh Hoover leaves for Indiana. I think Craig with TCU quarterback, I think he's going to be really good for the Horned Frogs this season.
Love it. Who do you think will be the biggest surprise?
I'll go with another team, Kansas State. You look at last year, they lost 5 games by 1 possession. They were 6-6 a season ago. Colin Klein steps in, and I think there's some questions in the trenches, offensive line, defensive line. But I'm optimistic that Avery Johnson's going to return to the form he was at in 2023 as a true freshman because Colin Klein's back with him. And now the fact that, with 5-5, we could see maybe 2 years of this pairing of Avery Johnson and Colin Klein. I think they could be really good. They've got a pretty manageable schedule as well. They were there with Texas Tech. It was a 1-possession game, late in the third quarter, and then turnovers kind of derailed that thing. Kansas State, I think they could be a big surprise this year in year 1 under Colin Klein.
Yeah, love it. And then who do you think will be the biggest disappointment?
I'll go Houston. Last year they were a 10-win team. I think the schedule is a gauntlet in the Big 12. They go at Texas Tech, at Kansas State, at Utah. Then they got a back-to-back road swing with Colorado on one end of the country, and then at West Virginia. I think 8's on the table, which would still be solid for Houston, but I think there's a little bit of a step back from what they were a season ago, because I think there's a lot of conversation that they might be in this grouping with BYU and Texas Tech. I just think the schedule hurts them. They got a great quarterback room with Wegman and then Keyshawn Henderson, the number 1 recruit. But I just think that schedule is going to be too much to overcome. So I think they're still maybe another year away from really breaking into that championship conversation with the Big 12.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you consider to be the best game on the schedule for the conference?
I'm biased here, but BYU at Utah, November 7th. 15 of the last 20 years, this game has gone down to 1 possession. It always lives up to the hype. It is... if anyone engages with the BYU-Utah rivalry online, it's as toxic as it gets online. These two fan bases do not like each other under any circumstances, and the games are always good. I think what's interesting, though, is while the fans don't like each other, the coaching staffs really do, and it's the new era of the rivalry with Morgan Scalley at Utah and Kalani Sitake. Now, Kalani and Whittingham, they were good friends and cordial, but it was kind of like boss and employee relationship. Whereas, Scally and Kalani they were on the front lines together, putting together defenses for Utah back in the day when Kalani was working under Kyle Whittingham. There's a great relationship there. And I think there's an approach with this rivalry now, both from BYU, and I think it's going to morph this way with Utah as well with Scally, where it's like, we want to win that game at all costs. But there's a lot of respect for those coaches, those people, that program, because it's basically one big family, the whole deal. And it's just a great game, though. And it's the one game. That's the thing about the Big 12, this new look 16-team Big 12. There's not many great rivalries. And that just say appointment television every single year. BYU and Utah is that game. So it's a biased pick, but, man, it always lives up to the hype with that game.
Yeah, I think that's a great pick. It is always a great game. And then college football playoff teams from the Big 12.
I'm going to go bold here, and I'm going to say Texas Tech and BYU. I think two teams can sneak into the conference or from the conference into the playoff. I just think that both of these teams, because of their recent success the previous years, and then I think this year with how the schedule's set up, they should both have really good records going into Arlington, and I think they both get in.
Love it. And then lastly, one bold prediction.
Two teams in the college football playoff, like I said. I think that would be huge for the Big 12, and I think that's pretty bold to go there. But I think there's a path, and I think the wild card again is BYU and Notre Dame, and I think for Texas Tech, it'll be an interesting conversation with them because I think we assume their strength of schedule will be light. Do they have to go completely perfect to get into the playoff? They might have to, but I think both of those teams somehow, some way sneak into the playoff and get two teams from the Big 12 into the playoff.
I love it. That is a bold pick, but I love it. And I wouldn't totally be surprised if you were right. So I'm excited for this football season. Thank you so much for taking the time to preview the conference with me. I really appreciate it. Can you tell people where they can find you?
KSLSports.com. I host a daily BYU podcast, Cougar Tracks, and then also coming up this fall hosting a weekly Big 12 football show, First and 12. It'll be on KSL NewsRadio and podcast, KSL Sports app. So pretty much anything KSLSports.com, BYU and the Big 12 got you covered. So, and X as well, and Instagram, Mitch_Harper as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mitch. I really appreciate it. And happy almost football season.
Thanks, Emily. Appreciate it.